was an issue that I thought was important, and I still think it's important. Why can't the federal government just stand firm on the stage 3 tax cuts? It was an election promise, an election pledge. Why can't the Prime Minister put an end to any doubt or debate about whether it's happening or not? And there has been debate, and he's been asked on various media programs, can you just say it's a promise? Can you promise, you promise, you promise? And he won't do it. And I also said just after 9 when I was talking about that I wasn't an economist. So we've gone to independent expert and economist, Saul Eslake, who joins us now to answer some of these questions. Good morning, Saul.
Good morning, Bill. Thank you for having me on the program again.
Nice to have you again. Happy New Year to you. So why can't he promise? And what's the reason we can't get a firm commitment out of him?
Well, I can't speak for Mr. Albanese, and I'm not a spokesman for the government, but my understanding is that the government, the Labor Party, the opposition as they then were, promised ahead of the 2022 election that they would deliver the stage 3 tax cuts, even though they had previously expressed reservations about them. And Jim Chalmers, the Treasurer, has said whenever he's been asked about it that they will deliver the tax cuts as legislated on the 1st of July 2024. Remember, these tax cuts were legislated by the Morrison Government. They are, to borrow a phrase that Paul Keating used in the same context, LAW, their law, and it would require an act of Parliament now for them not to go ahead. And there's no suggestion, I think, that the government plans to introduce legislation that would consciously and deliberately break an election promise. They'd be slaughtered in the opinion polls and probably at the real polls if they were to do that. So, there are certainly some people within the Labor Party who would like to see the stage 3 tax cuts deferred, cancelled or modified, and certainly the Greens want the government to do that. But as far as I understand it, the government is standing firm and saying it will deliver the tax cuts that are already in legislation. What I suspect they might be thinking about is whether they do anything else on top of that. Because as the legislation currently stands, the benefits from the stage 3 tax cuts to people on medium incomes are still relatively small. If you have a taxable income of less than $40,000, you won't get anything. If you have a taxable income of, say, $80,000, you will get a tax cut worth $875 a year. That must be about $12 a week or $15 a week. It's not a lot. Mm-hmm. The biggest benefits go to people earning more than $200,000 a year, because the threshold for the top tax rate of 46 cents in the dollar will increase from $180,000 to $200,000. People earning more than $200,000 a year will get $9,075 off their annual tax bill. So these tax cuts will, in contrast to the first two stages of the Morrison government's tax cuts, these tax cuts benefit those at the top end of the income scale, who, to be fair to them, do pay an awful lot of tax. People in the top tax bracket account for about 3% of all taxpayers, but they pay 30% of personal income tax. And this is one of the realities of Australia's tax scale, is that if you want to cut tax rates, which is what the stage 3 tax cuts are about, it's hard to do them without cutting the tax paid by the people who pay the most tax, which are people at the top end of the income scale. What I think the government may be contemplating, but we won't know until the budget is presented in May, is perhaps, in addition to what has already been legislated, which they promised to deliver, they might find a way of giving people on more modest incomes something out of additional tax cuts that they otherwise wouldn't get, and they will claim that as a form of cost of living relief, which wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing to do.
Okay, so I see where you're going with that. So what about the criticism then that it's going to run the risk of increasing inflation, which will then play into the hands of the Reserve Bank, and we'll see them either delay any sort of reduction in interest rates this year, which they're expecting, I think, was it late in the year?
Yeah, And that's a fair question. I think the first point to make is that the Reserve Bank, like everybody else, has known for a long time these tax cuts are coming. That is to say, they will have factored into their forecasts of growth in consumer spending and the economy more broadly, and from that into their forecasts of inflation. They will have factored something into it. So if inflation and economic growth turn out as they have forecast, in full knowledge that these tax cuts are coming, then it shouldn't have any additional impact on interest rates because they will have taken that into account in setting interest rates where they currently are. One point that I suppose defenders of the Morrison Government Stage 3 tax cuts might make in this context is that tax cuts that accrue disproportionately to higher income earners are more likely to be saved than to be spent, because that's what higher income earners do. They don't have to spend every dollar they get on the necessities of life they can afford, and they typically do put some of it away. They might invest it in something that will generate additional income, for example, whereas if you apply the same amount of money that the tax cuts will cost to giving cash grants to pensioners and people on other social security benefits or people on the minimum wage, almost certainly they would go out and spend a lot because they have to. So while there are criticisms to be made of the Stage 3 tax cuts from for want of a better word, an equity perspective, they're less likely to generate additional inflationary pressures that could in turn see the Reserve Bank putting interest rates up some more or delaying reductions in interest rates than if the same amount of money had been spent giving it to households on much lower incomes.
All right. Well, before we let you go, what is your crystal ball analysis of what we'll see with interest rates through 2024?
Well, although I acknowledge that there are some people who are expecting the Reserve Bank to cut rates this year, for example, just before Christmas, the Commonwealth Bank was forecasting that the Reserve Bank could cut rates 3 times from September through Christmas. Certainly some central banks overseas, like the US Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank, will be cutting interest rates this year, I think. But my crystal ball tells me, for what it's worth, that the Reserve Bank may well go throughout this year, leaving interest rates unchanged. I think the Reserve Bank here has consciously decided, although they haven't said this explicitly, to tolerate inflation being above their target for longer than central banks in countries like the US, the UK, Canada, and New Zealand, in order to hold on to as much as they possibly can of the gains that have been made in recent years in reducing unemployment and underemployment. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not a criticism of them in saying that. But I think it helps explain why, although they put interest rates up a lot, as everyone knows, 13 times by 4.25 percentage points, our cash rate of 4.35% is actually lower than the 4.5% in continental Europe, the 5% in Britain and Canada, the 5 3/8% in the US, and the 5.5% in New Zealand. All of those central banks started putting rates up earlier than our Reserve Bank did, and they have put them up by more, which is why I think at least one reason inflation has come down more quickly in those other countries than it has here. And I think the corollary of the Reserve Bank being less aggressive, if that's the right word, in putting rates up in order to slow the economy down and get inflation down, is that they will also be slower than other central banks in similar countries around the world to start cutting interest rates.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense, and that's what it always is when we speak to you. Saul, thank you very much for your insight and your time.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
Independent economist Saul Eslake, busting it all down for us. So there you go, the legislated. They're going to happen, these Stage 3 tax cuts, and he's forecasting then we won't see any reduction in interest rates throughout the year, but we probably won't see any increases either. We'll see a state of play that is static, on hold.